Imagine walking into your new job, excited to start fresh, only to be immediately judged, dismissed, and belittled. What would you do? Would you stay silent or take a stand? For Alyssa Carter, the decision was clear. She wasn't just any new hire. She was the undercover CEO, and what she was about to uncover would change the company forever. Her stomach tightened as she stepped through the doors, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. She had anticipated tension, perhaps some resistance. But the sheer hostility in Margaret Holden's voice was something else entirely. A flicker of anger sparked within her, but she buried it. This wasn't the time to react. This was the time to observe. Every moment of dismissal, every whispered comment, every instance of favoritism, she would remember them all. Because soon, it wouldn't be her taking notes. It would be them answering for their actions. Alyssa Carter entered Lancaster and Company with the kind of nervous energy any new employee might feel on their first day. But she wasn't just any employee. She was the newly appointed CEO, stepping into the office under the guise of an entry-level assistant. Her goal was simple: to experience the company culture firsthand, free from the biases that often accompanied a leadership title. What she didn't expect was how quickly she would find exactly what she was looking for. The moment she stepped into the office, she was met with immediate scrutiny. Margaret Holden, the department manager, barely glanced at her before making it clear she did not belong. "Excuse me, but you're in the wrong place," Margaret said, her tone dismissive. Alyssa remained composed. "I was told to report here," she responded evenly. Margaret folded her arms, eyeing Alyssa's modest attire with thinly veiled disdain. "And who exactly hired you?" Alyssa handed over her employment letter, knowing full well what was coming next. Margaret barely glanced at it before tossing it back onto the desk. "Figures. HR keeps hiring just anyone these days," she muttered under her breath. Then, in an even lower voice, she turned to a passing employee and added, "Bet she's some diversity hire, probably filling their quota." Alyssa had anticipated encountering biases, but hearing them directed at her so openly was jarring. Rather than reacting, she made a mental note. This was only the beginning. Determined to blend in, Alyssa spent her first few hours quietly observing how employees interacted. As she watched, she wrestled with an internal debate. Should she step in now or wait to see the full extent of the problem? Every fiber of her being told her to call out the injustice she had already witnessed, but she knew that acting too soon might allow the perpetrators to cover their tracks. No, she needed undeniable proof. She had to be sure that when she made her move, there would be no way to escape accountability. Patterns quickly became apparent. Certain employees were consistently given leadership roles and high-profile assignments, while others, particularly those from minority backgrounds, were assigned menial or repetitive tasks. Daniel, an older black employee, was one of the first to catch her attention. He worked diligently, yet every task he was assigned was tedious, thankless, and far beneath his level of experience. She noticed how his suggestions were brushed aside in meetings, how he was never invited to discuss important projects, and how Margaret barely acknowledged his presence. Meanwhile, younger white employees were given assignments that allowed them to shine. They were encouraged to share ideas, present in meetings, and take on responsibilities that positioned them for promotions. Maria, the receptionist, faced a different but equally troubling situation. During a morning meeting, she confidently offered a suggestion for improving workflow. Before she could finish her thought, Margaret cut her off. "Sweetheart, let the men handle the important stuff," she said with a condescending smirk. Alyssa noticed how Maria's face fell. Her confidence shattered in an instant. The worst part? No one else in the room reacted. It was clear this was a regular occurrence, one that employees had learned to accept. Later in the morning, Alyssa witnessed another disturbing display of bias. At exactly 8:55 a.m., Daniel arrived at his desk, set down his bag, and prepared to start his workday. Before he could even sit, Margaret's sharp voice rang out. "Late again, Daniel. This is getting old." Daniel looked at the clock, but said nothing, merely nodding and getting to work. 10 minutes later, a younger white employee strolled in at 9:15 a.m., coffee in hand. He greeted Margaret casually, and she barely looked up from her computer. "Try to be on time tomorrow." "Okay," she said lightly. The difference in treatment was impossible to ignore. As part of her cover, Alyssa was given her first task of the day. She had assumed she would be assigned simple clerical work, filing paperwork, organizing schedules, or assisting in small projects. Instead, Margaret handed her a broom. "You can start by organizing the supply closet," Margaret said, smirking. Alyssa maintained a neutral expression. "Is this part of my job description?" she asked. Margaret laughed. "Oh, don't be so sensitive. Everyone has to start somewhere." Alyssa glanced around the office. No one else seemed to be assigned such a demeaning task, especially not the younger white hires who had started the same day as she had. They were being trained on office software and company procedures, while she was expected to clean. Swallowing her frustration, Alyssa took the broom and walked to the supply closet. But instead of simply doing the task, she used the time to listen. The closet was near the break room, and conversations carried through the thin walls. Over the next hour, Alyssa overheard multiple conversations that confirmed what she was already seeing. Employees spoke in hushed tones about complaints that had been filed against Margaret, none of which had ever been addressed. One employee mentioned that HR had a complaint box, but no one had ever seen action taken from it. "Nothing ever happens," one voice said. "Upper management doesn't care." "Yeah," another replied. "And if you push too hard, you just get reassigned to a worse department." Alyssa's stomach turned. This wasn't just about Margaret's behavior. This was a workplace that tolerated discrimination and silenced those who spoke up against it. As the day wore on, Alyssa's suspicions were further confirmed. She watched as Margaret laughed at inappropriate jokes made at the expense of minority employees. She saw how employees like Daniel and Maria had learned to shrink themselves to avoid conflict. She noticed how people with the right connections were given opportunities regardless of merit. But the moment that solidified her decision to act happened in the afternoon meeting. Maria, despite being ignored earlier, tried again to contribute a valuable insight about improving the company's scheduling system. Before she could finish her thought, Margaret sighed dramatically and raised a hand. "Enough, Maria," she said. "Just focus on keeping things organized, all right?" The room fell silent. Maria's face flushed with embarrassment, and Alyssa felt something inside her snap. She had planned to observe for weeks before making any decisions, but what she had seen in just one day made it clear that waiting was not an option. Change needed to happen, and it needed to happen now. Alyssa walked into Margaret's office without knocking, closing the door firmly behind her. Margaret barely looked up from her computer, her fingers still lazily tapping at the keyboard. Her expression was one of mild annoyance, as if Alyssa's presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes before finally meeting Alyssa's gaze, the corners of her mouth pulling into a smirk as she leaned back in her chair. "You again? What is it now? Another petty complaint?" Margaret barely glanced up from her computer, already exasperated. Alyssa sat down across from her, hands folded calmly. "Actually, yes. And this time, it's about you." Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, please. You've been here one day, and you think you've got it all figured out? You don't even know how things work around here." Alyssa leaned in slightly. "I know enough. I've watched how you treat people. I've seen the double standards, the blatant discrimination, the way you silence employees who have ideas. And I've heard the complaints that somehow never make it past HR." Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. "You have no authority to accuse me of anything. I run this department, and if you have an issue, take it up with upper management." Alyssa's eyes locked onto Margaret's. "I am upper management." Margaret blinked. "What?" Alyssa straightened in her seat. "I am Alyssa Carter, the new CEO of Lancaster & Company. And as of this moment, you're no longer employed here." For a moment, Margaret was too stunned to respond. Then she scoffed. "You expect me to believe that? This is a joke. You're just some what?" Alyssa interrupted. "Some diversity hire? Some quota you assume needed filling?" "That's exactly the kind of thinking that has created the toxic workplace I just spent the last day witnessing firsthand. You don't just foster discrimination. You encourage it, you enforce it, and you protect it. But today it ends. Margaret's face turned red. You can't just fire me. I've been here for years. I know this company better than you ever will. Alyssa stood up. If that were true, you would have known that treating people fairly is what makes a company strong. You had a chance to lead, to create a workplace where everyone had a fair shot, and instead, you build a culture of fear and exclusion. That ends today. As if on cue, two security guards appeared in the doorway. Margaret's eyes darted between them and Alyssa. This is a setup. You planned this from the start. No, Margaret, Alyssa said calmly. You planned this the moment you decided to treat employees unfairly. You made your choice, and now, I'm making mine. The security guards stepped forward. Margaret stood, her hands trembling with frustration. This isn't over, she hissed. For you, it is, Alyssa replied. But for this company, it's just the beginning of change. Margaret stormed past the guards, her face flushed with anger. But as she stepped out of her office, she froze. The entire department had gathered outside, their eyes fixed on her. Some employees exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction. Daniel stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, while Maria, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, lifted her chin slightly, as if finally reclaiming a piece of her dignity. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of fear, but of something new, relief. Margaret's presence had long been a storm cloud over the office, and for the first time, the sun was beginning to break through. Employees who had once been afraid to speak watched in silence. Some were in shock, others in quiet relief. Daniel and Maria exchanged glances, hope flickering in their eyes. Alyssa stepped out after Margaret and turned to face the employees. This company deserves better, and from today forward, it will be better. A slow clap began in the back of the room, then another, until the office filled with quiet but growing applause. Change had finally arrived. Lessons from the story. Leadership requires action. Not just a title. True leadership is about stepping in when it matters. Alyssa didn't hide behind a corporate office. She placed herself in the heart of the problem, saw the reality, and took action. A good leader listens, understands, and creates meaningful change. Workplace discrimination is real, and it thrives in silence. Margaret's behavior was allowed to continue because no one in management took a stand. Many employees, like Daniel and Maria, felt powerless because they believed speaking up wouldn't change anything. The story reminds us that change is only possible when someone dares to confront injustice. Employees deserve respect and fair treatment. A healthy workplace is one where all employees, regardless of race, gender, or background, are valued and given equal opportunities. No one should have to shrink themselves to avoid unfair treatment. Real change requires courage and accountability. Firing one bad manager isn't enough. Alyssa didn't just remove the problem. She sent a message that a toxic culture would no longer be tolerated. True progress happens when accountability is built into the foundation of a workplace. Meaningful message from the story. This story is a reminder that one person can make a difference. Whether you are an employee facing unfair treatment or a leader responsible for change, you have the power to shape the environment around you. Discrimination, favoritism, and workplace toxicity only persist when they go unchallenged. Speaking up might not be easy, but it is necessary. Let this be a call to action. Whether in the workplace or in life, stand for fairness, for dignity, and for those who feel unheard. Because real change begins when someone chooses to say, enough is enough. Our perspective. At Story Precious, we believe in telling stories that inspire, educate, and create real-world impact. Alyssa's journey is not just about a single workplace. It represents countless employees who face unfair treatment every day. We hope this story encourages you to reflect on your own experiences and the power you have to influence change. Whether in leadership or as an everyday individual, standing up for what's right is always worth it. If this story moved you, there's more to come. Subscribe to Story Precious for more real-life lessons, leadership insights, and inspiring stories that challenge injustice and celebrate courage. Hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread awareness and create a world where fairness and respect are the standard, not the exception. Join us on this journey, because every story has the power to make a difference.